Ahoy there, and welcome back to Video Games and Such. I recently got my hands on an Analogue Super Nt, and if you saw my last video about the retro USB AVS, it's a similar device, only it plays Super NES games as opposed to NES games, and so far I'm really loving it. It's so incredibly customizable, you might just get lost in the menus. It has up to 1080p HDMI output, and it ran my Super EverDrive flash card with no problems. The really cool thing is, with the jailbroken firmware, you can also run Super NES and Super Famicom ROMs straight from an SD card that's plugged into the side of the console. The firmware is easy to update if you have a blank SD card or one you don't mind wiping. The jailbreak SD card function doesn't have full compatibility for games that, for example, use the Super FX chip and other such chips. So for games like Yoshi's Island, Super Mario RPG, Kirby Superstar, and so on, you'll need to get your hands on a real cartridge, or play them on the Super NES Classic Mini or something if they're on there. Now, this time around I decided to take a look at some Super Nintendo games and some hacks that people have made for them for various purposes. The first game I'd like to look at is Super Mario All-Stars. When this first came out, I was really amazed. You could play 4 Mario games from the NES with upgraded graphics and sound. These kinds of compilations were unheard of back then when this first came out in 1993. When I was growing up, whenever I went to friends' places who had the NES, almost all of the time was spent on the Mario games because they were just so awesome. So when it came to All-Stars, it was really cool to play the original games with updated graphics. Super Mario Bros. Of course is a classic, and The Lost Levels was a very difficult game, and at the time we didn't know the story that most people know pretty well by now. Super Mario Bros. 2, the odd game out, so to speak, with the gameplay certainly, looked great with upgraded graphics too. I remember I had a friend who had Super Mario All-Stars back in 1994, and from what I recall, we spent all of our time on Super Mario Bros. 3, probably because it was the most comprehensive, and many would say the best game in the compilation. And with all of these games now having the ability to save your game as well on Super Mario All-Stars, that certainly was a pretty big selling point. You didn't need to leave your console on all day and night or turn it off without finishing the game anymore. You could always just come back to it and resume where you left off. As I started to get a bit older, I started collecting video games around the time I was about 12 or 13 in 1999, and when I got my hands on my own copy of Super Mario All-Stars, there was something that seemed a bit off about Super Mario Bros. And The Lost Levels, aka the Japanese Super Mario Bros. 2. Namely, what happens when you hit your head on a brick. In the original games on the NES and Famicom Disk System, when you hit a brick, you would immediately bounce off it and it'd be sent down towards the ground straight away. In All-Stars, when you hit a brick in those two games, you keep travelling upwards for a bit before being sent down. And as a person who's a bit anal about game physics, this really bugged me. So I'd always opt for the original Super Mario Bros. On NES instead. And this also made playing Lost Levels the way I'd like to difficult, and led me to either play it on an emulator and later on Virtual Console, and more recently on my AVS with the EverDrive N8 as seen in my previous video. And this brings me to the first hack that I'd like to show you. First of all, for those not aware, a ROM is a digital version of a game that has been converted to a file by connecting a cartridge to a computer somehow, and they call it dumping the ROM, where the contents of the cartridge are put onto the computer and turned into a file. And a hack is when that video game ROM file's content has edited graphics, sound and or gameplay, which are done by a variety of means, using certain software and programming and whatnot. This first hack is called Super Mario All-Stars Brick Fix, and the name really speaks for itself. It fixes the physics when you hit a brick with your head to make it like the original games. And I will be putting links to these hacks in the description of this video. You need to patch a ROM, so you need to source the ROMs yourself and then patch them using software. And if you go to the website romhacking.net, it will give you some instructions on how to do that. Now, here's a little footage of this ROM hack in action while you've been listening to me talk. And the other really cool thing is that there's also a brick fix for the Super Mario All-Stars plus Super Mario World compilation that came out later for the Super NES. So these can actually be enjoyed on emulators, or if you have the original hardware, you can put it on an SD card or what have you and put it onto a flash card. Or if you have one of these consoles, like the Super NT, you can just stick it on an SD card, stick it into the console, and off you go. The main problem that I've encountered previously with these sorts of hacks is that they're made for the NTSC versions of the games, which means that if you have an unmodified PAL system for the NES in this case, like I do, then you're out of luck. This is why I'm really glad that I now have the Analogue Super NT, because it plays games in both NTSC and PAL, much like my retro USB AVS, so that I can play these hacks to enjoy enhanced versions of these games. And note that not every single hack for every console will run on the original hardware. Some of them will require an emulator because they haven't been optimized for the hardware, or they use tricks that kind of don't work on the original hardware for whatever reason. Now these ones in this video worked fine on the Super NT, so while I can't guarantee it, I can only assume that they would work on an NTSC Super Nintendo console. But of course, because I haven't tested it, I can't guarantee it, so if you have any issues running these on the original hardware, feel free to leave a comment or let me know. Keep in mind you do need to make sure that you've patched the ROM correctly, and also that you've patched the correct ROM, because some ROMs have headers, some ROMs don't. Sometimes there's different versions of ROMs, so you just have to make sure that you have the right region ROM and the right ROM in general, so keep that in mind if you do try and play these yourself. And speaking of regions, having an unmodified PAL Super Nintendo, most of these ROM hacks were off limits to me before I got my Super NT, because they were designed for the NTSC, typically US and sometimes Japanese versions of these games. With some consoles, NTSC ROMs will run on an unmodified PAL system, but perhaps slowly. But on the Super Nintendo, I couldn't get any NTSC ROMs to run at all on my PAL system. So having the Super NT now opens up the ability for me to play all these ROMs and ROM hacks that previously I'd need to play on an emulator. And please note that when I say playing a ROM on the console, I mean with a flash cart. You're not generally going to be able to play a ROM on a console without some sort of flash cart or something similar to that. The next game I'd like to look at is Mortal Kombat. I only remember playing this game once or twice in the arcades when I was a kid. I was pretty young, and I remember an older kid being mean to me and beating me at the game and wanting to play on his own. I also had it on the PC when I was a kid, and I used to play a fair bit of it. The footage that you'll be seeing here is from the Super Nintendo version, though as opposed to the arcade version. Mortal Kombat was very novel at the time when it came out because it had digitized graphics that were much more vivid than what had come before it. They had filmed actors doing all sorts of moves and then converted them to sprite graphics to give the game a more realistic graphical style. And that, combined with the violence and blood, made it a sight to behold. Mortal Kombat came out for all sorts of systems at the time, and probably the most famous console ports were on the Super Nintendo and the Sega Mega Drive, aka Genesis. This Super Nintendo version you're seeing footage of here is a fairly faithful port, aside from a couple of things. One being that there is no blood. It's been replaced with what is assumed to be sweat. Now, how could you have a game like Mortal Kombat without blood? Well, this is the question a lot of people were asking at the time, and from what I gather, for this reason, the Genesis Mega Drive version, which did have blood, although you did need to enter a code to turn the blood on in that one, it did outsell the Super Nintendo version. Again, I believe that's the case. Let me know if I'm wrong. The other main change is that some of the fatalities on the Super Nintendo version were made less violent. The fatalities on the Genesis Mega Drive version were watered down too, but with the blood code turned on, they were restored to be more like their violent arcade counterparts. So this ROM hack, Mortal Kombat Blood Color Fix, seeks to fix the blood issue by basically turning the sweat back into blood, and it does a pretty damn good job at it. I'll include here a reasonable variety of gameplay footage so that you can see it for yourself. Now, I'm not very good at pulling off fatalities except maybe scorpions, which is easy, so I can't say whether the fatalities have been made more like the originals, but I can fairly safely assume that they haven't. But please comment and let me know if I'm wrong about this. If you like violence and or you want to play a more faithful version of the Super Nintendo Mortal Kombat, then give this ROM hack a try. You could also play the Mega Drive Genesis version, which is also good, although the graphics aren't as good. I do also tend to like the controls better on the Super Nintendo version, and this is especially true if you only have a 3-button controller for the Mega Drive or Genesis. Anyways, I hope you enjoy this footage of me playing this blood-filled hack of Mortal Kombat for Super Nintendo. And finally, I have saved the best ROM hack for last. This one definitely had the most effort and time put into it, and it is without a doubt the most comprehensive of the ones I am showing you today. The previous hacks have changed the gameplay and the graphics respectively, and this one does all of the above. The original game that this is based on, Super Mario World, is of course a classic, and one of the best games on the Super Nintendo in my opinion, although, to be honest, I do need to play more of the games on its massive library. But what can I say about Super Mario World that hasn't already been said? Instead of rambling on about Super Mario World, I'll just cut to the chase and show you the hack. This one is called Super Mario World Odyssey. It's a beta, meaning it's not quite finished, but it is still awesome. And it's inspired by the Nintendo Switch game from 2017, Super Mario Odyssey. In that game, playing as Mario, you could throw your cap, and if you threw it at an enemy, you could possess or capture the enemies and control them until you no longer wished to and wanted to do something else. You could also jump off your cap when you threw it to jump to places you might not otherwise be able to reach. And this ROM hack allows you to basically do the very same thing in Super Mario World on Super Nintendo. And while it's unfinished and it's not exactly perfectly polished, for example, the cap doesn't always look quite right, it doesn't always wind up on the enemy's head exactly, and sometimes there are other glitches here and there, but in my opinion this is a fantastic ROM hack and one of the best I've ever played. I haven't played all the way through it. I'm up to Vanilla Dome so far, but from what I've played you can get inside almost any enemy, and even some non-enemies like some platforms and such. It's hilariously fun, and there's so much to do. I'll showcase a bunch of situations I found myself in here. The way you throw your cap is by pressing either the L or R button, and if you throw it at an enemy or object that you can capture, much like in Super Mario Odyssey on Switch, Mario will disappear and you'll occupy the enemy or object wearing Mario's cap, and depending on what you can control, you can move in various ways. For example, if you're in a flying enemy, you can fly around. A walking enemy, you can walk around. If you're in a fish, you can swim around, and so on. Pretty straightforward. But clearly, so much time and effort has gone into this hack, and I absolutely love the attention to detail, such as Mario's messy hair without his cap. I hope you do enjoy this footage of me playing the hack as much as I enjoyed playing it. And look, even if you don't have the ability to play this one on a console using a flash cart or whatnot, I do highly recommend playing it even on an emulator, because it's just a real great deal of fun. So I must say, I am really enjoying the Analogue Super Nt. It's so great that I can enjoy both PAL and NTSC games for the Super Nintendo and Super Famicom in HD. This device really is incredible, and the attention to detail is really just mind-blowing. It's so insanely customizable. My favorite thing is that you can even change the color of the power LED light, including changing between colors and the speed at which it changes. I set mine to change between all the colors of the rainbow, and it's very pretty, especially in the dark. I really love being able to load ROMs directly from the SD card slot with the jailbreak firmware. The ROMs load way faster than they do from my Super EverDrive, which practically makes my Super EverDrive obsolete unless I want to play it on my Super Nintendo. I'm hoping that one day a jailbroken firmware will bring the ability to play Super FX chip game ROMs and other ROMs for games that had exotic chips inside the cartridges. But we'll see about that. I'm not holding my breath. It's probably a lot of work. I can't imagine how hard it would be to get that to work. And this console's predecessor, the Analogue NT Mini, which is for NES and Famicom games, actually has a jailbreak firmware which allows playing other console ROMs from an SD card, including Sega Master System, ColecoVision, and a whole bunch of others. I really hope something similar comes to the Analogue Super NT, and if not, I've got my fingers crossed for something like a new Mega NT console that plays Mega Drive and Genesis games, and hopefully Master System games too. But we'll see about that as well. A girl can dream. And before I forget, thank you so much to the authors of these ROM hacks, without whom this video would not have existed. BMF54123, creator of the Super Mario All-Stars SMB1/Lost Levels Brick Fix. Dark Samus 993, creator of the Mortal Kombat Blood Color Fix hack. And last but certainly not least, LX5, creator of Super Mario World Odyssey. Anyways, that's just about it for this video. This is the first time I've attempted proper video editing, possibly ever. I might have done some in the late 90s, early 2000s when I was much younger, but I honestly cannot remember. So I hope the editing is okay. Feel free to comment if it's not. I think I did okay though. But thanks very much for watching, and have a lovely day. Once again, this has been Video Games and Such.